I've mentioned to you that out of the more than a million, over a million Jews that were living in Persia, only 50,000 of them decided to return back to Israel. Why? Because they thought, we're fine here. This is good enough. We have it pretty good here. Why should we return back to Israel, back to Jerusalem, and have to start rebuilding the city after it was burned down by Babylon? And so they decided to just stay. And so part of those people that are there, that is this Esther and her family. And so, again, they were born there. So her name is not a Hebrew name. It's actually Persian, and it's Esther, Estrella. That's where it comes from. And so she's truly the star of this book. And so we know that this is the focus of this book. We don't know exactly who wrote this book. Maybe it was Nehemiah, maybe it was Ezra. Some believe it was Ezra. But we see throughout the scriptures that God does always raise up specifically unique women to listen to God's voice and follow his will. God obviously does not choose only men or only women. He doesn't care. He wants to choose specific people that will actually hear his voice and follow his will. We see the stories of Ruth. We see the stories of Esther, Deborah, or in the New Testament, we see the story of a powerful woman. I would call her one of the leaders of the church in the New Testament. Her name was Priscilla. Now, this is a fun fact of Esther. Maybe you've heard this before. This is the only book in the whole Bible in which the name of God does not actually appear in the whole book. So you can read the whole book, and not once does it say Yahweh or Elohim or Lord or God. There, you could read the whole book, and you won't find it in this book. They never even bring up prayer. There's nothing about faith. They never even bring up the laws of Moses or the laws of God. They never bring anything of this up. Actually, in the New Testament, we know that New Testament writers, Jesus himself, the Gospels, Paul, they would always quote the Old Testament. They would always say quotes from whether it was from Isaiah or from the Psalms or even from Daniel, but they never quote from Esther. And so it's kind of interesting that this book is even in the Bible. When there were not only first there was the Jewish leaders, the Jewish priests that said, okay, which books are going to belong to our Jewish Bible? And they chose specific ones that obviously God used them to choose. And they said, okay, these books will belong to our Jewish Bible. They also added other books that were historical books. You might have seen a Catholic Bible or a Jewish Bible. The Catholic Bible includes those Jewish historical books, like 1st and 2nd and 3rd Maccabees. There are books like that us Christians, you might never see before in our Bibles. But those are books that were included in the Jewish Bible, but they're more history books. Again, they don't really speak about God. They speak about battles that the Jews won, and they celebrate it. That's where they get Hanukkah from one of those Maccabee books. But by when the Christian church, like I mentioned earlier, 500 years ago, they said, okay, no, we need to go back to the Bible. We even need to really focus the Bible and allow the Holy Spirit to lead us to which books are actually the books that need to be included in our Bible. So they focused it on these 66 books. And so in those 66 books, like we've been saying from the beginning of this study back in January, that from Genesis to Revelation, every single book speaks about Jesus. I mean, it's just very, very obvious that it's all about Jesus from Genesis all the way to Revelation. But they decided also, those leaders at the beginning of Christianity, they decided that Esther should be included in this book, in our Bible. And so I wonder why. But there have been leaders, like even Martin Luther, who thought that this book, the book of Esther, should not be included in the Bible. But he also had issues with other books. He didn't like the book of James. He didn't like Revelation. But what we do know is that God is in this book. He's not very apparent in the book, like very obviously in the book, But he is in this book throughout this story, these 10 short chapters, but he's there in a very miraculous way. We know that God's ways are behind the scenes, but he always moves all the scenes that he's behind. Let me say that again. God's ways are behind the scenes, but he moves all the scenes that he is behind. So even though we might not see him always, especially today I think that's just how the Lord is working right now in this season, in these times. We might say, well, maybe God is really not there. But when we zoom out in our life and we begin to recognize, well, wait a minute, at the specific moment, like right here, right now, we could say, God, are you here? And we don't hear his voice, or we don't see an obvious sign that he's here or not. But then when you zoom out and you begin to think, well, wait a minute, throughout this day, how has God actually been there? And yeah, there's so many signs that he was there with you throughout the day, that he has you here. And then you zoom out even more. It's just a miracle that you're even here right now. It's a miracle that you're watching. It's a miracle that so many things have happened in your life that have led you to this relationship with God. You begin to see what we call God's providence. His providence is very different than his miraculous. We believe in the miraculous of God. We believe that God parts the Red Sea. We believe that Jesus walks on water. We believe that God heals the sick. This morning in our that meeting that I was saying with these pastors, I was just saying that I'm part of a new generation of leaders that we've heard about the miracles of the past. We've heard about the revivals of the past. I've heard of people coming in blind and them leaving with sight. I've never seen it myself. One of the pastors that's there, I think he's a little bit over than 60 years old. I think he's 70 years old this year. He was just saying how in a church service there was this girl that came in, this baby with her arm just crippled, just completely twisted, and that as they prayed for her, it just began to untwist, and then it just became completely normal, and she was completely healed. And those kind of stories, we hear about it, but we haven't seen them, and that's what we're praying for. We prayed about that on Monday. But that's the miraculous, and so that's where we see, obviously, that had to be God. But that's different than the providence. When God begins to move his hand in a way that looks very normal to us, it's very normal in our life. It's just the everyday things. You go to for example, interview to a job, or you were fired from one job, and you're like, I don't know where God is, or I don't know what's happening right now. Then you go interview at another job, and you get this job, and you start working there, and maybe you meet a friend that you end up leading to Jesus, or maybe they led you to Jesus at that job. These little things that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, you might have thought your whole world was falling apart, or that God wasn't really there. But when we begin to zoom out again, you start seeing how God is just always moving, and that's his providence. And so with the miraculous, God there's laws of nature, like a man is not supposed to walk on water. The ocean's not supposed to split in half, and people are supposed to walk on the water. Or if you're sick, or if you're blind, then you're blind, and that's it. Period. You're going to be blind the rest of your life. But God, through miracles, He cancels out the laws of nature, and he does whatever he wants. He heals. He parts the water. He walks on water. But providence, he uses the laws of nature. He uses just the everyday normal things. And what seems like coincidence or just normal to us, that's actually God moving. And so in this book, God's name might not be in it, but his hand is in it all. In the same for us today. We might not see God with our eyes. We might not hear the thunderous voice from heaven. We might feel like, man, it just takes so much faith to believe in God. But again, when you begin to think about where your life is right now, whether you're 70 or you're 7 or however old you may be, you start thinking about how wow, like God has been there, and he has put different people, different decisions, just begin to think, how is it that God led you to this church? How is it that God led you into that relationship or that friendship? And you just begin to see God just always moving. You know that God does not owe us an explanation at the moment, but then later on we're like, wow, God, that's what you wanted to do. Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says that God works all things according to his will. And so, again, this year has been a year of providence. It has been a year in which we're like, oh, why is all this happening? 2020 is crazy. What's next? Now we just started July. Happy July, by the way. We just started July now, and we're like, okay, what's next? What's going to happen now? We've had murder hornets. We've had flesh-eating rats. Now they say that, I saw the news today, that there's like flying snakes. There's like snakes that are jumping out of trees. I guess it's always happened, but people are making a bigger deal now because it's 2020. And so we're seeing all this crazy stuff, and we're like, what is happening, God? Where are you? But for those of you that might think that you're living just this ordinary, boring life, and you might feel insignificant, not much importance, you just have a regular job, it's not that big of a deal, or you just have a regular life. This is the story of a girl who gets elevated from just, you would call her a normal Jewish girl, to become a princess, a queen in a pagan kingdom. But God has her there for a very specific season and a very specific reason. And she will discover just through these normal stages of life how God has her there and how God will use her in that way. And again, we don't see, this is thus saith the Lord. There's no, this is God speaking in the book. We don't even see someone like kneeling down and praying and asking God for help. We're just seeing kind of like the main story, but us with our Christian eyes, with our spiritual eyes, we have to see how God is moving through this story. Now Esther is found in the Hebrew Bible in the section called the Ketubim, which is called the writings. It's kind of like the poetry of the Bible. There's these books, the Song of Solomon, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And these books, all these books, they're recited during festivals. And so that's why they're included there in the Jewish Bible. The Song of Solomon, it's recited during weddings, but also during Passover. The book of Ruth, they recited during the festival of Pentecost. And Esther is read the feast of Purim. And we'll see how in chapter 9 of Esther, this is the first time they celebrate it. And it started there in Persia, this festival, Purim. It was a celebration of God protecting his people once again. But without the book of Esther, we would not know what life was truly for those Jewish people there in Babylon. Again, it was a different time. Remember, again, like I said, only 50,000 went back to Jerusalem. Over 1 million of them stayed there in Babylon or in Persia. We know what life was like for those who went back to rebuild. We see it, we read it earlier in other weeks in Ezra and Nehemiah. So we can assume that the Jews didn't have it too bad there in Persia and Babylon, since more than 1 million decided to stay. But this book helps us understand that God is the God of the crisis and the God of the calm. He's the God of the crisis, but he's also the God of peace. When things are calm, we say, wow, yes, praise the Lord. God is real. I feel his peace. I feel his comfort. But when we have a crisis, when something bad is happening, when they're telling us we got to close down the church, when they're telling us that someone is sick, when they're telling us that we're losing our jobs, that's where we begin to say, where are you, God? Where are you? Well, how come you've left me? We need to be reminded, and we're going to see it here, that he never leaves us. He doesn't leave us. He is still right there. We may feel stressed out, but God never panics. God is not up in heaven going, oh no, now there's corona. Oh no, now there's murder hornets. Oh no, now there's this or that. Now there's flying snakes. No, God. Nothing surprises God. He's there. He's still with us. He was with us through everything, and he's going to stay with us there. He's the God of the calm, and he's God of the crisis. The book of Esther, as all these books are, they're divided into sections. Esther is divided into 3 sections, and that's how we're going to read this book tonight. Chapters 1 and 2, it's the supernatural providence. Again, God moving behind the scenes. Chapters 3 to 5 is the satanic plottings. Satan is trying to get involved and trying to stop the will of God. And then the last chapters, 6 through 10 is this sovereign protection from God. So let's start off with chapters 1 and 2, and it's the supernatural providence. So, chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, the whole book begins with a party. Now it came to pass in the days of this king, Ahasuerus. It's always these names. It's always these either Hebrew names or Persian names that are difficult to read. But in the days of Ahasuerus, this was Ahasuerus who reigned over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. So if you could just imagine that map, basically all of Asia, not counting China and the far east, but India to Ethiopia, from India to Africa, that whole Middle East section was governed by the king of Persia. Ahasuerus, he's better known by the Greek name Xerxes. You might have heard that name, Xerxes. And what's interesting about this is that Xerxes is the dad of Artaxerxes, who let Nehemiah return to Jerusalem. So when we read Nehemiah, this book is happening during the story of Nehemiah also. And so this story here, again, this man, Ahasuerus or Xerxes, the Greek name, he's the father of Artaxerxes, who let Nehemiah return to Jerusalem. Verse 2, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was Shushan the citadel, that in the third year of his reign he made a feast of all his officials and servants. The powers of Persia and Media, the nobles and the princes of the provinces being before him, when he showed the riches of the glorious kingdom and the splendor of his excellent majesty for many days, 180 days in all. So, like we just said, this was a long party. So they start off with this party. It was a 6-month party. It was all paid by the government. Talk about wasting our taxes. They just were partying. The king wanted this 6-month feast festival party. So what's happening? The year is 483 BC, 400 years, almost 500 years before Jesus. And so what's happening during this time is that way out west, so this is in the Middle East, but in the west, over in Asia, there's a king. His name is Philip of Macedon. And he is the first one to begin to rise this Greek empire. And so later on, this Greek empire just takes over the world, all of Europe, all of the Middle East. And so historians say that the reason for this 6-month party was the way for the king to get all of the leaders from the different regions and all the nobles and all the military leaders, because he's trying to gather them to promote this war. And he's trying to create this battle against the Greeks. The king, he knows that the Greeks are coming. They're taking over Europe. They're about to come there. So he's trying to get them excited and get them united. It's pretty wise of him, smart of him to create this family. We're all in this together. We're all different regions, but we're going to party for 6 months, and we're going to get ready for this battle. And, of course, eventually he does lose to the Greeks, even though he does all that. Philip of Macedon, he has a son named Alexander, and he thought he was very great. They called him Alexander the Great. So that's the son of who was king at this moment. So later on, they take over the Persian Empire. The first world empire was Babylon. Then it was Persia. Now this third world empire is Greece. And this is all right after this story of Esther. And so Alexander, later on, he brings Greek culture around the world, around Europe, around the Middle East, including the language, Greek language. He starts building roads throughout Europe and throughout the Middle East. Later on, the Roman Empire takes over. They're the fourth greatest empire. They come and they finish off those roads, and they take the Greek language and they share it to more nations. Again, all of this is happening so that, again, the hand of God, the providence of God, so that by the New Testament, the gospel is now traveling through all these nations, through all these same roads that were built by them, with the same language in Greek. and now the gospel is being shared so much easier. So I hope that you're able to see how God is always setting up the perfect events for the New Testament to happen. And that's what's happening here. Even though this is almost 500 years before Jesus, all of this, God is just putting everything together so that the gospel could be prepared and shared by the New Testament. So really, it took these years, 500 years, or even a couple thousand years before Jesus, but Jesus then arrived at the perfect time. So this is a 6-month feast. It finally ends, but then it's followed by another feast. He then does another party, a 7-day party, and that feast is for the officials that help the king. So he's saying, thank you guys for helping me do these 6 months of partying. Now I'm going to throw a party just for you guys. And look at verse 9. Verse 9 of chapter 1 says, Queen Vashti also made a feast for the women in the royal palace, which belonged to King Ahasuerus. And in these times, women, they could not eat with the men. So that's why she had one over by herself with the women. But here, the king, he commands his wife, Vashti, to come and be with him there in front of all the other men, in front of all the other officials. When we read the story, it just kind of looks like he's probably just trying to show her off. He's kind of like his trophy wife. He just thinks she's beautiful, and he's like, hey, sweetie, get over here. I want to show you off to my friends here. So he tries to get her to come eat with him. But the story says that she refuses to eat with them. She's like, And history tells us that she was actually, this woman, this queen, Vashti, she was actually the granddaughter of someone very, very famous. We heard of King Nebuchadnezzar. She was the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king from before. So, if you could imagine, if she's the granddaughter of King Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man before Babylon fell, you could probably assume that she was very spoiled, that she always had things go her way. And here is this king telling her, I want you to come and let me show you off to my friends. She says, I'm not going. So verse 12, but Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, brought by his eunuchs. Therefore the king was furious, and his anger burned within him. So the author of this book, like I said, maybe Ezra, he wants us to know that the king, he was so mad at this moment. He felt disrespected. He was just annoyed at his own wife. The author wants us to know that probably because this king, he was known for his anger. An example of this is that in one point of history, it says that Persians, he had about 300 men go build this bridge. And then there was this huge storm that tore the bridge down. And so he then goes over to the ocean, to the water, and he's so mad that he starts kicking and punching, and then he had like a whip with him. And I thought the story was going to say that he was doing this to the builders. No, he was doing that to the water. He was so mad at the ocean that he starts kicking the ocean and punching it, and he was cursing it and yelling at the waves. And they're all watching him do this. He's so mad that the ocean would do this, disrespect him that way. But then he took the 300 men that built it, and he beheaded all 300 of them. So this is the kind of man he was. So why was he so angry? Again, because his wife said no to him. So he takes her off the throne, and he sends out a decree, and he sends it throughout the empire, and he says, women, you better obey your husbands or else. And so he's almost telling all the men, all the husbands, if your wife disrespects you in that way, doesn't obey you, then let her go or do whatever you want, kill her. And so this is what happens. So he takes her, he removes her from being the queen now of Persia. So now he's single. But something is happening now in between chapters 1 and 2. It's a very important thing that's happening. Now, this right here is not in the Bible. But again, when we're reading the Bible, it's always good to know, zoom out, and what's happening in the rest of the world. I think that sometimes as Christians, we read the Bible and we think that only what we're reading, that's the only history that was happening at the time. And honestly, to the rest of the world, the little things that were happening to Israel, they didn't mean anything. They knew that there was this group of people out in the desert that they worshiped only one God, and they were kind of weird because they had these laws, and they were very conservative, and they didn't sacrifice babies. They didn't do weird. To them was normal. To them it was weird that they didn't do the weird things. And so there were just these weird people out in the middle of nowhere. They said that they had this father Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and they traveled through tribes. But honestly, compared to the Greeks, compared to the Persians, compared to Babylon, these were just these little annoying little people to them. And so even by the Roman Empire, by their time, again, it was just these people out there in the Middle East and Jerusalem causing problems for them. When we look at the history of Israel, it's always good to see it in the middle of what was happening around the world. And so what was actually happening here, in between chapters 1 and 2, there's this great battle happening in Europe with the Greeks. And it's the Battle of Thermopylae. Most of us haven't heard of this battle, Thermopylae. But has any of you heard of the movie 300? Remember that movie, the 300? It was based on this battle, the Battle of Thermopylae. There was only 300 Spartans, and they were fighting the Persians. So these same Persians, this same king, the king that just got rid of his wife, he goes to battle with the Spartans. And so the Persians, they have this huge army. They have hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but they end up losing to these Greeks, these Spartans. And they realized that they had many men, but the difference was that the Greeks, even though they didn't have a lot, they had few, but they emphasized on the individuals, which is very insightful for us to understand. Instead of just having a bunch of soldiers, they had like Navy SEALs. They had men that were trained, and even though they only had 300 of them, all 300 of them were like specifically trained to be the best soldiers, and so they were really focused. They weren't just a bunch of soldiers kind of out there in the middle of the field. And so that's what helped the Greeks be able to take over the world, because it wasn't that many of them. They were able to go through different places faster, quicker, less of them instead of a big army. There was a saying, one Greek soldier is worth 10,000 or 10 Persian soldiers. So one Greek soldier is enough for instead of having 10 Persians. So even though they were smaller, again, they took over the world. And so this king, King Ahasuerus or King Xerxes, is now feeling down. He's sad. He's upset. He's got that anger issue. And so he goes back home. And now he doesn't even have a wife to go back to. And so what does he do? Like a good king, like a good pagan king, he turns to his other women. He's got a harem. He's got this group of women there for him. And so he goes to them. But by chapter 2, verse 1, or verse 2, it says, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus subsided, see, he was so mad. He's mad about his wife, mad about losing to the Spartans. He remembered Vashti, what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So this is the first ever beauty contest. And so he wants to find a new wife. So he says, bring me all the young, beautiful girls. And so I want a new wife. So there in the court of the palace, there was a man named Mordecai. And he hears about this. And he's the cousin of Esther. So in verse 7, chapter 2, and Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, or it's another name for Esther, that is Esther, or Estrella, or star, his uncle's daughter. So, for she had neither father nor mother. I don't know why, but it seemed like a lot of our Sunday school classes taught us that he was her uncle. But no, it's cousin. And so the young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Mordecai thinks he's going to go take his cousin and put her in this contest. And he's thinking, she's beautiful, she's young, perfect age to be married. This could help us both out. I don't have to take care of her anymore, but also maybe she could take care of me now if she becomes the queen. And so, but we need to notice this. This is very strange for a Jewish man to be thinking this way. Because even though they never bring it up, the laws of God or the laws of Moses from the first 5 books of the Bible, it forbids a Jewish woman to marry a pagan man, which the king was pagan. He wasn't Jewish, not by blood and not by religion. And so, but that's never mentioned. And so, remember, they were not there. They never even read while they were in Persia as slaves, they never even had the Bible or the laws with them, the scrolls. And so they had to return back to Jerusalem. They found the scrolls and they started to have revival in Jerusalem. They finally started reading the Bible again, and they repented of their sins, and they got to know God again. But while they were in Persia, they just still had some traditions, and there were still a few that still would pray and believed. But not here. Mordecai, he's doing something that was a big sin. And also Mordecai knew that if Esther loses, once she goes into the palace, if she loses, she's not just going to be let to go back to her home, back with him, back to Mordecai. No, she's going to be part now of this harem. She's basically going to be a slave to the king. And so this is a great risk. So as we could tell from this is that how far the Jews have gone from God. He's basically what we would call a backsliding Jewish man. He's making these decisions not according to God's will. He's not doing what God has commanded them to do. But again, see, we think so black and white when it comes to God. And so if it was this way, then we would simply see, he disobeys God, they're doing things against God, God steps away, he just lets them be, they're in sin, whatever. But no, God knew what they would do, but God is still in control. He's still in control of the situation, and he's allowing these things to happen for a greater purpose. And so, according to Jewish historians, they said that Esther surpassed all women in beauty. That she was the most beautiful woman. Again, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Like, depends on what do you think beautiful is. But most Jewish historians, they said, oh, she was the most beautiful woman ever back then. And so verse 12, chapter 2. Each young woman's turn came to go into King Ahasuerus after she had completed 12 months of preparation. It was 12 months of getting a glow up, of getting beautified. 12 months of makeover, according to the regulations for the women. For thus were the days of the preparation apportioned 6 months with oil of myrrh, and then 6 months with perfumes and preparations for beautifying women. Man, so for the husbands that get upset because your wife spends 2 hours at the salon, at least it's not 6 months. But for the ladies, for the women, for the girls, I mean, just imagine being there for 12 months. You were just this young lady, probably back then, in Bible times. Women, you were there to cook, to clean, to have babies as soon as you can. So by age 12, 13 years old, you're having children, you're cooking, you're having a husband, and that's your job. But for these women that were part of this beauty contest, no job, no cooking, no cleaning, just being taken care of, pampered for 12 months. Just living it up. Probably they were feeding them grapes and fanning them and giving them oils. I mean, 6 months of oils and then 6 months of perfumes. They were just at the spa for 12 months. Man, just beautiful. Now the Bible, just as a side note, the Bible does talk about physical beauty. It's not a problem to be beautiful physically. Doesn't say to neglect it. I say that because there's a lot of people, even Christians, that say they get real spiritual and they're like, oh, the outward doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And so they won't shower for weeks because they're like, that's all physical. That's not what matters is the spiritual. Stop it. Go and comb your hair and go and iron your shirt or something. You look presentable. But we should never leave those things before the spiritual, obviously. 1 Peter chapter 3. Right now, Abby's all about getting bangs, and tomorrow maybe we go get her some bangs. But I'm like reading her this verse. I said, "Stop it, Abby." It says in 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 3, "Do not let your adornment be merely outward." Or in other words, don't just dress up the outward, arranging the hair, wearing gold, or putting on fine apparel. Now, Peter's never saying it's bad to wear those things or do those things. He's just saying don't let it merely be that. Verse 4, "Rather, let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the incorruptible beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is very precious in the sight of God." We know that the physical, that's going to be corrupted. The physical is going to go, but you could still be beautiful at 150 years old. You'll still be beautiful because it's on the inside. And so I just say that because if we're talking about beauty here, that it does matter to God. The outward is important, but what's more important is the inner. So chapter 2, verse 16. So Esther, now it's this moment. Esther is finally taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So she wasn't told that she was actually Jewish. She never told anybody that he doesn't know that she's Jewish. And he doesn't know that her cousin Mordecai is Jewish. But, so because of that, she actually helps him now get a higher position in this royal court. The way it's described, it says that he's sitting at this gate. So that's kind of like a position for a judge there for the Persians. So it's just like royal court, and then he's one of those judges there. So now he's gotten a raise. While he's there in this royal court, he hears of this plan to kill the king, to kill King Ahasuerus. So he brings it up, he uncovers it, he gives the names of those that wanted to kill him. The plan was destroyed by Mordecai. The problem, though, is that he was never rewarded. And so he thought, well, I should get a reward for this. I just saved the king. But no one ever even mentions Mordecai yet. And so, again, that's providence. At the moment, he felt, God, come on, I just saved the king. How come I can be blessed because of this? How come I can't receive a blessing because of this? But God is moving. God is allowing all this. And I hope that word "yet" is always brings comfort to us, because when we live selfishly, doesn't it feel like when we're living for God, we see other people, we see people that they're not always doing it the right way, but they're driving the best cars and living in the nicest houses, and we know what they're doing. We know what they're doing to get paid. And sometimes it's even legal, but they're doing it, they're like stepping over people, they're doing whatever possible to get those positions and make more money and get with politicians and all that stuff. And here we are as Christians and kind of looking at them. There's even a psalm, I think it's Psalm 36, where it says the sinners seem to be favored, and they seem to be blessed, and they seem to have everything. And here I am, God, says David. I'm trying to obey you and serve you, and it seems like I'm the one suffering. But when we live for justice, when we live for God, we know. I know it's kind of frustrating sometimes when we're in the present, but we will be rewarded later. We will be rewarded in heaven. We know that that's a greater reward. Forget cars, forget houses, forget money. The greatest reward, because again, why lose our soul to gain the world, but then we lose our soul, or gain eternity and keep our soul. And so, again, Mordecai, he doesn't get rewarded just yet. But what he does is actually recorded in the historical writings of the Persians. Somebody there finds out, gets his name, and writes it down. Mordecai saved the king from death. And that gets written down. They close the book. No one talks about it again. Chapter 3. So, chapter 3 is now the second section. We just saw God moving, God setting things up. But now the second section is the satanic plotting. Now, here comes Satan trying to stop what God is doing. Chapter 3, verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. Now this is a new person, new character. Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes who were with him. And all the king's servants who were within the king's gate bowed and paid homage to Haman. For so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai would not bow or pay homage to him. So maybe Mordecai was still a little bit bitter, a little bit upset, because no one was, he probably was thinking, I should be at that position. But King Ahasuerus, he picked Haman and he put him up. Or maybe Mordecai was also being, he knew that as a Jewish man, you weren't supposed to bow down to anyone else. Maybe Mordecai knew about the true character of Haman. He wasn't a person to bow down to. But notice here something strange. There's always these little things that you got to stop and pause and be like, okay, Holy Spirit, why are you telling us in this verse, in this Bible, in this book, that he was an Agagite? It's just, first of all, it sounds weird. He was an Agagite. But this shows us how far-reaching the cost of disobedience goes. When you disobey God, the consequences don't just affect you or us, they affect future generations. All the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15, remember the story of King Saul. King Saul is told to go and destroy the Amalekites, to go and destroy them, just finish them off. The Amalekites were worshiping other gods, but they were also sacrificing babies. They were sacrificing young ladies. They were just doing the most awful, evil things. And God says, I want those people. They will not change. You need to destroy them. Just finish them off. So Saul goes and he says, God, I'll kill the bad guys, like the really bad guys, like the leaders, the soldiers. But I'm going to keep some of their riches, some of their treasures. But I'm also going to keep some of their animals. And he decides to keep the king and the king of the Amalekites. And his name was King Agag. So he keeps him, and instead of killing him, Samuel finds out and he says, God said that you're supposed to destroy them all. And Saul says, well, I thought I would bring it in. Saul got all spiritual, and he says, well, I'm bringing him to sacrifice him to God. And Samuel says, stop it. He pulls out a sword, and the story says that he actually cuts up King Agag. I feel like I gag every time I say his name. That he pulls out a sword and he cuts him up into pieces and finishes them off. Don't mess with Samuel the prophet. But someone in his family escaped, and that's where the Agagites came from. And from that comes Haman. So there would have never been a Haman who's out to kill the Jews if it wasn't for Saul, like 2 generations before, if Saul would have just finished off those people. But he was disobedient, and he ends up wanting to do it his way, and now, generations later, it's still affecting the people of God. And so, again, that disobedience is now affecting Mordecai. Verse 6. So, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So he thought, before he even beat up Mordecai for not bowing down, he thought, for they had told him of the people of Mordecai. So instead, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, the people of Mordecai. So he thought, I'm just not going to kill you. I'm going to kill you and all the other Jews that still live here in Persia. So about 1 million people now, they are the ones that are about to be killed. Haman said in verse 9, if it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So far the king doesn't know that his new wife is Jewish, so he just knows that someone broke the law that he had established, that everyone had to bow down to Haman, because to bow down to Haman is like bowing down to him. And this one Jewish man, he didn't do it. So the king said, sure, fine, go ahead and kill all the Jews. And so he tells him, I'm going to bring you 10,000 talents of silver. That's a lot of money. Where is he going to get that from? He figured, if I kill all the Jewish people, I'm going to take their silver, their gold, their treasures, and I'm going to bring it to the king. And so remember, this is all after the movie 300. This is all after the Persians had suffered from Greece. So they're down financially. Their morale is down. They thought that this would actually be a wise thing to do. So kill the Jews. That's less people to feed, less people to worry about, and also we'll have their riches. We'll have their gold and silver. Some of it that actually came with them from Jerusalem. We'll take it, and we'll have it for ourselves. So Haman sent out a letter to 127 provinces that on this date, he said on this date in the letter, all the Jews will be eliminated. They'll be killed. And so it's so strange that history always repeats itself. It's very familiar. In the 1940s in Germany, we know Hitler and the Nazis, they actually called it the Jewish problem. They were saying that Jews were subhuman. They were not humans. They made them wear a star. They put them in concentration camps. They thought, let's destroy the Jewish people. Now, remember, I've been saying this from Genesis, that there's always a satanic strategy. If, as soon as Adam and Eve sinned, God said, there will be one from the seed of the woman, that he is the one that's going to destroy the snake or destroy Satan. And so, since then, Satan has always tried to destroy the nation of Israel, or the nation of God, the people of God, to stop God's purpose. Whether it was killing all the babies in Egypt, or story after story of the Philistines, or the Babylonians, or the Persians, or just different armies coming against Israel and trying to destroy them. Or by the time of Jesus, that King Herod wanted all the firstborn babies to be killed. It's always been Satan's plan to destroy and stop God's plan. And so that's why there's always been what's called anti-Semitism in history. There's always been people against the Jewish people. It's not a coincidence. Even to this day, there's some nations, there's some presidents around the world that will say, we want Israel to be just completely destroyed and taken off the face of the earth. They just hate Israel. And a lot of it, they don't even know why. They just know they hate them. Well, it's Satan always trying to stop the plan of God through his people. In Esther chapter 4, verse 1, when Mordecai learned what had happened, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes. It was like a sign, an outward symbol of like mourning, because he knew, he's like, we're all going to die. We're all going to die soon. And we went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. And then he goes and tells his cousin Esther. He goes and tells her he found this out. Esther didn't know yet. And Mordecai told them, Esther's servants, do not think in your own heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. You say, just because you're his wife now, or the queen, doesn't mean you're not going to die. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Now, that's pretty awesome. That phrase right there, Mordecai, I don't know if he's saying it prophetically. Maybe he doesn't even understand what he's saying. But he's saying, you might be silent, but God's still going to bring a deliverer from another place. Now, if that was prophetic about Jesus one day coming and another Messiah coming and saving us, then he's going to do it. But he's telling her, if don't wait for that moment, because at this moment right now, this is the best sentence in this whole book, and I think it's the most well-known sentence in the whole book of Esther. He says, yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's where we get that phrase that we always say, Lord, for a time such as this you have called us. Again, God is not mentioned in the book, but again, here it's implied. Here is obviously God. He is saying, You have been called for a time such as this. The reason why you're the queen in the Persian palace is because God has placed you there. And so this is a Jewish man. He somehow still understood that covenant, that promise from God all the way to Abraham. He was convinced that God would send a deliverer, a savior. But maybe you're the queen to be an instrument to save the Jews. He's probably saying, you were called for this, and God has placed you there. This is not an accident. This is all providence, Esther. God has moved. He's been moving behind the scenes all along. And look at where you're at. God has placed you there. Again, in our lives right now, we may feel like we don't have anything important happening. And we might feel, well, maybe I just have this little job. I just have an office job, or I just work at home, or I'm not really making a difference. It is right there where you're at, right there that God is where God has you, in that school, in that junior high, in that high school. He has you there for 2020, for this time. And so wherever you're at, God has a purpose for that moment. And who knows, 10 years from now, you're going to look back and you're going to be like, wow, that moment led me to this moment, to this moment, to this moment. And because all those things happened then, this happened in my life. And not just in my life, but in other people's lives. So, verse 15, then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan and fast for me. Again, never brings up prayer in the whole book. But for the Jews, when they're fasting, them in prayer also. So, she says, go fast and pray for me. Neither eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. She says, I know this is wrong, and if I perish, well, then I perish. That's a brave woman. She's saying, I'm going to go in, and if I die, I die. If I die, is gain, basically. So why does she say that it's against the law? Persian kings back then, they kept themselves in a room by themselves. They would not allow anyone to enter into their room. First, for protection, because they knew that if anybody just came into their room, whether it was a servant or not, even his own wife could try to kill him. So he was always very by himself. But also traditionally, they thought if you keep the king separate, it was to keep his dignity. That he's not hanging out with normal people, that there's something special about the king. So if you come in and he did not like you to be there in the room with him, then you would probably die. So she's thinking, I'm a Jew, I'm going to die anyway. He's going to eventually find out they've already done this law that all the Jews are going to die. So if I die, I'm going to die anyway, so might as well try this out. I'm going to go, and maybe he saves us. Maybe he saves me. Again, this is where providence is coming in. God is putting all this. He's opened this door. This is all real history, real Jewish, Persian history, but God is moving. When there's a problem, God always answers with providence. There's a problem, but God is moving. It's like when Joseph and Mary, they were told by the king, by the emperor of Rome, that they had to return back to Bethlehem. And what happens? They return, but it was all because that was God's plan for the Messiah to be born in Bethlehem. Or when Joseph is a prisoner in Egypt, and he ends up as a prisoner in Egypt. Again, the hand of God is moving, and eventually he becomes the right hand in command to the Pharaoh, and his own people. He ends up blessing his own people and his family. All of these things that at the moment seem terrible, they seem like they're falling apart, there's a problem, but God always answers with providence. Chapter 5, verse 2. So it was, when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, that she found favor in his sight, and the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther went near and touched the top of the scepter, and the king said to her, what do you wish, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you up to half the kingdom. So Haman went out that day joyful and with a glad heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand or tremble before him, he was filled with indignation against Mordecai. So Haman once again sees Mordecai, and he's angered at him once again. He goes and tells his wife, Haman does, he tells his wife about what happened, and his wife tells Haman, well, why don't you just go and kill him? Why don't you hang him? Go hang Mordecai. And then just go party with the queen. So the queen says, I want a party. I want this great festival. And I want or Haman, Prince Haman, there with us. So Haman feels good about himself, but Mordecai doesn't bow once again. His wife says, go kill him, and then go party. Verse 14, then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, let a gallows be made. It's like this pole, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. In chapter 6, now it begins the ending of this book. Now it's the sovereign protection. So now we saw Satan's plotting, but now the sovereign protection of God. So God uses now insomnia for his glory. The king could not sleep. And in chapter 6, verse 1, he's restless at night, can't sleep. The night the king could not sleep, so one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles. So they bring him like the history of Persia. And they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bithana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, the doorkeepers, who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. Here we go. You see, back then, when Mordecai did something, no one found out. They just wrote it down, put it in a book, never read it. Time passed, and now this is the time. God had it planned out for this moment. Then the king said, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. So then, Haman comes in at that moment. At that moment first, the king says, well, then I will do whatever the first person that comes in, whatever idea they have to how we're going to bless this Mordecai, we're going to do that. At that moment, Haman comes in, and Haman sees the king. He's so happy. He wants to bless him. And Haman thinks he's happy about him. So Haman is very self-centered, and he's thinking, oh, this is about me. They're about to bless me. So Haman came in, and the king asked him, what shall be done for the man who the king delights in honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king bestow to honor more than me? And verse 8, let a royal robe be brought which the king has worn, and a horse on which the king has ridden, which has a royal crest placed on its head. Then let his robe and horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princesses, that he may array the man whom the king delights to honor. Then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done for the man whom the king delights to honor. So Haman's making all this up because he thinks that it's going to be for him. Then the king said to Haman, great idea, Haman. Hurry, take the robe and the horse, as you've suggested, and do so for Mordecai the Jew, who sits within the king's gate. Leave nothing undone of all that you have spoken. This is a great movie. Because right there now, Haman is like, oh, really? Mordecai, the one I hate, the one I'm going to kill all the Jews because of him, now you're going to bless him? That was supposed to be for me. And then chapter 7 and verse 3, again, no one knows yet that she's Jewish yet. So the Queen Esther, in verse 3, answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. It's right there, she admitted she's Jewish, and that she's saying, this is what I desire. Have we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss. So King Ahasuerus answered and said to the queen, who is he and where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Now it seems, at this moment, we're reading this story quickly, and we're seeing how it just seems like God and Satan are playing like a game of chess with real life kings and queens. And he moves one, and Satan tries and moves the other piece, and Satan goes, checkmate. Because Haman thought he was doing it his way, and he's putting all this, where actually Satan thought he was using Haman to do all this, and he's going to destroy the people of Israel. And all of this is happening behind the scenes, so that now in front of the scenes, finally the queen says, I need you to save my people, and it's all his fault. And so the king hears this, he goes off to the courts, and he goes and thinks about this. He comes back, and the story says that he finds Haman like leaning on Esther, and he doesn't really say that he's doing anything bad, he's just like leaning on her. But maybe the king at that moment thought, wait a minute, are you like trying to go for my wife now, trying to take Esther from me? And so that just finished it for the king. And so he has Haman arrested, and he has Haman hanging on the same gallows or the same poles that he had built to hang Mordecai. So he actually built it for himself to die. So now the problem is now fixed in chapters 8 and 9, and all of that was all so that the people of Israel would be protected, and God uses Esther to do this. Again, all she wanted, it doesn't really say much about her and about what her desires and all of this. All it says is that she was just kind of allowing herself to be used by God and faithfully having the courage to save her people. Now, the king then makes a new edict. Well, first there was the edict to kill the Jews, the law to kill the Jews. And for the Persians, you couldn't, even in the United States, there's ways to change laws, veto a law. For the Persians, you weren't allowed to do that. Once it was a law, it was irrevocable. You couldn't change it. But he does change it a little by saying, okay, they're going to be killed, but the Jewish people will be able to defend themselves. So he allows them to defend themselves, and they actually do, and they're not killed. And so there's this great festival. They celebrate because of this. And in Esther chapter 8, verse 17, and in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews because fear of the Jews fell upon them. That's awesome right there, that after all this, the Jews were the ones going to be killed. God saves them, but not just to save them. God saves them for a purpose, because after they were saved, now they're being used so that people become now Jewish also. Now, not Jewish by blood or anything, obviously, but Jewish by religion or by faith. They started to believe in the one true God. This is our life right here. This is our salvation. We're not just saved from death itself. He does all this. He sends us a deliverer. He sends us a savior. He sends us our hero, Jesus. He comes in the middle of it all. He stops it from us being killed. But then from our salvation comes new believers. And that's what happened there. That they started to celebrate. People saw how God was protecting those people there in Persia. Now Persians are becoming Jewish. From them thinking, what is the purpose of all this? From leaving Jerusalem, ending up in Babylon, the Persians come in, and now the Persians are becoming Jewish. That's amazing. And let me finish tonight with chapter 10. Mordecai is now promoted. He's now finally has what he always waited for. This is the good. Finally, we have a book with a good happily ever after. It seems like every book always, the people of Israel always go right back to the same stuff, and it's always like a bad ending. But chapter 10 actually ends well. Mordecai's promoted, kind of like the story of Joseph, the stories of Daniel. And it says, for Mordecai the Jew was set. You see how short chapter 10 is? You could read the whole chapter 10 and say, I read a whole chapter tonight. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus. Wow, he became the second to the king, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. Beautiful story tonight. And I hope that, again, we simply see God's hand moving in places where we might say that, well, that's not really God, that's just normal life. No, in the normal movements of life and whatever's happening. And may we have, I'm praying that I may have the understanding, the discernment, the wisdom to not just see politicians doing their thing and the media doing their thing and then just kind of like not even notice what's happening, but to always zoom out and say, okay, what is actually happening right here? How is this actually happening? What's working right now? And how is Satan trying to do something, and what is God? How is he answering? And so we see this in this story. Again, God is never literally mentioned, but we see him throughout this story. Very obviously God moving there. So is there any? Yes? Uh-huh. Exactly. Exactly. No, thank you. I was thinking right now, I was like, there was that one last thing that I was going to bring up, and I didn't write it down, and that was it. Thank you. Thank you, Holy Spirit.